I'm going to talk about the length-tension relationship of skeletal muscle and apply it to some common exercises. I'd like to start by telling a story from when I was in grad school. I was in the gym lifting weights with a friend of mine, and I was doing some seated leg extensions, also known as knee extensions. Suddenly my friend stops me and says, "You're doing it wrong. Don't let your back round. It's bad for your back, and it's cheating." I have considered his points many times and have wanted to make some counterpoints. My counterpoints are that 1. Rounding the back during this exercise will not likely cause back pain. 2. Rounding the back is a product of posteriorly tilting your pelvis. 3. Posterior tilt of the pelvis optimizes knee extension force production by minimizing active insufficiency of the quads and passive insufficiency of the hamstrings. 4. The length-tension relationship of muscle is the mechanism responsible for driving the effects of passive and active insufficiency. 5. Adjustments to the machine can allow you to achieve similar effects with less rounding. 6. I don't recommend rounding or arching or any movement of the spine if any of those movements aggravate your pain or whatever your symptoms are. Okay, let's talk about the length-tension relationship of skeletal muscle. As the term implies, it is the ability of muscle to generate tension at a specific length. That length is obviously going to be affected by joint position. This length-tension relationship is affected primarily by two mechanisms. 1. The nature of the sarcomere units within skeletal muscle. 2. The elastic properties of non-contractile components of muscles and tendons. For the sake of simplicity, we won't discuss the properties of sarcomeres in depth. Sarcomeres are simply the individual units that make up skeletal muscle. These units create a muscle contraction. They operate a little bit like Goldilocks, meaning that they contract best under a specific muscle length. If they are lengthened too much or shortened too much, they will not contract as optimally, as shown in this graph. The contractile components of muscle refer to the structures within the muscle that don't actively contract, but which have elastic properties that can generate passive force when stretched, as shown in this graph. Notice that when you combine these two properties of muscle, the sarcomere and the non-contractile components, the muscle can generate the greatest amount of force in a lengthened position. So if you had to think simply about the muscle's ability to generate force, a simple rule would be that a shortened muscle is not as strong as a lengthened muscle. I would caution that this may not be true of all muscles. The gluteus maximus, for example, appears to be best suited for producing hip extension force when the hip is in an extended position, meaning that the muscle works best in a shortened position. There are undoubtedly other physiological and biomechanical properties of muscle at work that can explain this variance, but we will spare ourselves from digressing. I believe that this length-tension relationship becomes more important to understand when addressing two joint muscles. This brings us back to our topic of pelvic positioning during a seated knee extension. There are two muscle groups that play a role in force production during this exercise, the quadriceps and the hamstrings. The rectus femoris is the specific quadricep muscle that crosses the hip and the knee joint. The hamstring group also crosses both joints. This means that these muscles will be affected by hip position during active knee extension. When in the seated position, the hip is flexed. This means that the rectus femoris is shortened at its proximal end, and the hamstring is lengthened at its proximal end. So when the knee extends, the rectus femoris shortens at the distal end, creating an overall shortened muscle. As we mentioned before, a shortened muscle does not produce force well, resulting in active insufficiency of the muscle. The hamstring will simultaneously lengthen at the distal end, which creates a lengthened muscle, which creates a passive stretch that opposes knee extension. This is known as passive insufficiency of the muscle. When the pelvis posteriorly tilts, the rectus femoris lengthens, and the hamstrings shorten, which reduces insufficiency of both muscle groups, and therefore improves knee extension force production. It is now time to put these ideas to the test. Let's head to the gym. Alright, you made it this far. I just want to demonstrate a couple of variations to the seated knee extension exercise and make a couple of points. First, notice how far forward my seat is in this video. It forces my back to be more upright, meaning that I can't lean back when I extend my knee. In fact, it is even hard for me to round my back, and I'm having a really hard time producing any knee extension force at all. Now I'm going to adjust my seat back so that I can have more freedom of movement of my trunk and can lean forward if I want to. I mentioned earlier that you could adjust the machine. I was referring to the seat back position. So now with the seat back, I'm still going to try to keep my torso very upright while extending. It's pretty subtle, but you might be able to notice that my knee does not fully extend. It is very difficult to lift much weight this way. However, if I round my back and posteriorly tilt my pelvis, I can easily produce a forceful knee extension movement. It turns out that I can produce a similarly forceful knee extension movement by simply leaning back. I also may round the back slightly, but it is not as significant. This might be a nice modification if you have back pain, or are trying to simply be as back friendly in your training as possible. Well, that about wraps it up. Thanks for hanging in there. I hope this video was helpful and that I didn't miss any major points. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to give it a like. Until next time.